The massive alien vessel appeared in Earth's orbit on a Tuesday morning without warning. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of Haven 7, the orbital platform that served as humanity's first line of greeting for visitors from the stars. He watched the ship's elegant curves reflect sunlight as it drifted closer, and his heart hammered in his chest. First contact. The moment humanity had dreamed about for centuries was finally happening. The aliens called themselves the Vextar, and their ambassador was a tall creature named Kelthrin, who stood nearly 8 feet high with skin that shimmered like oil on water. Kelthrin arrived with a delegation that included beings made of living crystal called the Jrel, and floating clouds of colored gas called the Morphians. They gathered in the main conference room, and Jake noticed how the aliens moved with careful precision, as if every gesture was calculated and practiced. Ambassador Kelthrin spoke through a translation device that made his voice sound like wind chimes. He explained that Earth had been observed for some time through intercepted radio signals and satellite transmissions. The Galactic Coalition, a union of 47 different species, had decided humanity was ready for contact. Jake felt pride swell in his chest until Kelthrin began discussing the results of their biological studies. Dr. Lisa Grant sat beside Jake, and he saw her jaw tighten as Kelthrin described human physiology. The aliens had analyzed human anatomy from medical broadcasts and educational programs. They noted the fragile bone structure, the inefficient digestive system, and most importantly, the severe limitations in work capacity. Humans required 8 hours of rest every single day. They needed frequent breaks for sustenance. Their muscles fatigued after relatively brief periods of exertion. Kelthrin spoke kindly, but the message was clear. Humans were weak. The purpose of the visit became apparent when Kelthrin proposed a joint operation. The Coalition had discovered massive deposits of a rare element called quantium on a moon orbiting a star in the Kepler system. This element powered their faster-than-light drives and was incredibly valuable. They invited Earth to send observers to witness Coalition mining techniques. It was meant as a generous offer, a chance to learn. Jake understood the subtext. Humanity could watch but not participate in real work. Captain Greg Foster, a weathered mining supervisor from the asteroid belt colonies, leaned forward in his seat. He was a broad-shouldered man with calloused hands and a face that showed decades of hard vacuum work. He asked if humans could join the actual mining crews rather than just observe. The aliens exchanged what might have been concerned looks. A Jrel named Crystalline Unit Vor spoke in tones that sounded like glass bells ringing. The work would be extraordinarily demanding. 3 months of travel followed by months of intensive excavation in harsh conditions. Coalition workers could labor for 72 hours straight before requiring rest. Humans would collapse long before that. Lieutenant Amy Brooks, the youngest member of the Earth delegation, studied the data the aliens had provided on her tablet. She was a sharp-eyed woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. Something bothered her about their analysis. The alien data was based entirely on recommended human work schedules and optimal rest patterns. It showed what humans should do to stay healthy, not what humans could do when circumstances demanded more. She whispered this observation to Jake, but the moment had passed. The meeting stretched on for hours as diplomats discussed terms and conditions. The Morphian representative, a being of purple and gold mist contained in a clear suit, expressed concern about human safety. They had regulations protecting lesser-developed species from exploitation. Jake felt his temper rise at the phrase but kept his face neutral. He had not waited his entire career to be patted on the head by gas clouds. As the session wound down, Greg spoke up again. His voice was rough from years of breathing recycled air in mining stations. He asked for just a small human crew to work alongside the Coalition teams, not leading the operation, just participating. Proving that Earth could contribute, the aliens conferred among themselves in a series of chirps, chimes, and color changes. Finally, Kelthrin agreed. 10 humans could join the 200-member Coalition crew. It was obvious they were humoring the primitive newcomers, but Jake accepted immediately before they could reconsider. The selection process took 2 weeks. Jake chose carefully, picking not just skilled workers but people who understood what this meant. Greg Foster was the obvious choice as second in command. Lisa Grant would monitor human health and serve as a bridge to alien medical staff. Amy Brooks brought her scientific mind and attention to detail. He selected Danny Wright, a genius engineer who could fix anything with duct tape and determination. Helen Cruz was the best pilot Jake had ever seen, able to fly supply runs through asteroid fields that made other pilots refuse missions. Kevin Palmer had been security forces for a decade and never panicked under pressure. Susan Bailey was a geologist who had mapped half of Mars from underground tunnels. Nick Ford handled communications and had learned 6 Earth languages just for fun. The last choice was Claire Jensen, fresh out of the academy but top of her class and hungry to prove herself. They met as a group for the first time in Haven 7's training room. Jake looked at the 10 faces and felt the weight of responsibility. They were not just representing themselves. They were representing all of humanity. Every action would be judged. Every mistake would confirm alien suspicions that humans were too weak for the galaxy. Greg stood and addressed the group in his straightforward way. The aliens thought humans were fragile. They thought humans needed constant rest and would break under pressure. He did not blame them, because human medical science taught people to take care of themselves, to work reasonable hours and maintain work-life balance. That was good advice for daily life. But humans were capable of far more when needed. Everyone in this room knew it. They had all pushed themselves beyond recommended limits at some point. They had all worked double shifts, pulled all-nighters, kept going when their bodies screamed for rest. That was the human edge. Not strength or speed, but the ability to just keep going. Lisa added a warning. They would be monitored constantly. Any sign of distress and the aliens would pull them from duty to protect them. They needed to work hard but also work smart. Stay hydrated, eat properly, stretch tired muscles, and take care of small problems before they became big ones. The goal was not to destroy themselves proving a point. The goal was to show what sustainable human effort actually looked like. The coalition ship, designated Eternal Harvest, was scheduled to depart in 3 days. Jake spent those days reviewing mining procedures and studying alien psychology. He learned that most coalition species worked in intense bursts followed by long recovery periods. Their ships ran on skeleton crews during rest cycles, with automated systems maintaining basic functions. It was efficient for their biology, but created downtime that seemed wasteful to Jake. On departure day, the human crew assembled in the docking bay with their gear. Each person carried a small pack of personal items and Earth mementos. Claire had a photo of her parents. Danny brought a worn baseball cap. Helen carried a small flag. They were leaving Earth behind, traveling farther than any human had gone before, and they had something to prove. Jake watched his crew board the alien vessel and felt a mix of pride and anxiety. The galaxy thought it knew what humans were capable of. In the next few months, they would learn otherwise. Humans might need rest, but they had been underestimated. That was often humanity's greatest advantage. The interior of the Eternal Harvest was nothing like any human spacecraft Jake had ever seen. The corridors curved in odd angles that made his eyes hurt if he looked too long. Soft blue light emanated from the walls themselves rather than fixtures. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and copper. The human crew stayed close together as they were led to their quarters, a section of the ship modified for their biological needs. The journey to Kepler 442b would take 3 months. The coalition crew operated on a strict schedule that became apparent within the first week. The Vextar workers would labor intensely for 3 full days without stopping, then retreat to special chambers for an entire day of what they called regeneration. The Jurel followed a similar pattern, though their crystalline bodies required different conditions. The Morphians cycled even more frequently, needing to reconstitute their gaseous forms every 48 hours in specialized containment pods. Danny Wright found himself fascinated by the ship's reactor systems. He spent his assigned rest periods wandering down to the engine room where Crystalline Unit Vor oversaw the power distribution. The Zrel engineer communicated through vibrations that Danny's translator converted to speech. Vor was surprised to see Danny during off hours. The human should be resting in his quarters. Danny shrugged and explained he felt fine. He had slept 7 hours and now he was awake. Sitting in his room doing nothing seemed wasteful when there was interesting work to see. Vor ran a biological scan with a handheld device that made Danny's skin tingle. The Zrel studied the results with what might have been confusion. Danny's muscle tissue showed no significant fatigue markers. His cardiovascular system was operating at normal levels. By Vor's calculations, Danny had worked a full shift just 8 hours earlier. He should still be in a recovery phase. Yet here he was, alert and ready to work again. Four filed this observation in a report but did not understand its significance yet. Helen Cruz encountered a similar situation when a Morphean navigator named Drift became ill with spatial disorientation syndrome. The condition affected gaseous species who spent too long calculating faster than light jumps. Drift needed 3 days in a stabilization chamber. The ship could operate on automated navigation, but having a pilot actively monitoring was safer. Helen volunteered to cover the extra shifts. She flew the massive vessel for 18 straight hours, her hands steady on controls that felt strange and oversized. When she finally returned to quarters, she slept for 7 hours, ate a large breakfast, and reported back to the bridge ready to continue. The Morphean crew gathered around her in a rainbow of concerned colors. They asked if she was certain she had recovered. 18 hours was a marathon shift even for species built for endurance. Helen smiled and assured them she was fine. She had once flown supply runs in the asteroid belt for 30 hours during an emergency rescue operation. This was actually easier because the ship's systems were so well designed. The Morpheans rippled with colors that her translator said meant astonishment. Dr. Lisa Grant took detailed notes on all these interactions. She observed that the alien species were indeed capable of impressive feats of sustained work. A Vextar could lift loads that would crush a human. A Jrel could calculate complex equations in seconds that would take human computers minutes. But they all required substantial recovery time after these exertions. It was like they burned bright and hot, then needed to cool down completely before burning again. Humans operated differently. They could not match the peak output of most coalition species. Greg Foster was strong but could not lift what a Vextar could manage. Amy Brooks was brilliant, but could not process data as fast as a Jrel computer mind. But humans could maintain a steady pace for much longer periods. They recovered quickly from moderate exertion. An 8-hour work shift followed by 7 hours of sleep left them ready for another 8-hour shift. They could do this day after day without the extended recovery periods other species required. Jake noticed the aliens watching his crew with increasing interest. During the second month of travel, Ambassador Kelthrin requested a private meeting. The tall Vextar diplomat settled into a chair designed for his frame and regarded Jake with eyes that had no pupils. He expressed curiosity about human rest patterns. The ship's monitors showed that humans were active during what should be their recovery periods. Were they suffering? Did they need medical intervention? Jake explained the concept of rotating shifts. The 10 humans did not all rest at the same time. While 5 people slept, 5 worked. Then they switched. This meant humans were always active somewhere on the ship, contributing to various tasks. It was standard procedure on human vessels. Kelthrin's skin rippled in a way that suggested confusion. But this meant humans never fully rested as a group. Who supervised the workers if leadership was also sleeping in shifts? Jake smiled and said they supervised each other. Every human was trained to work independently and make decisions. They did not need constant oversight. This concept seemed to disturb the ambassador. Coalition ships operated with clear hierarchies. Workers worked under supervisors who reported to commanders. During rest cycles, skeleton crews of lower-ranked individuals maintained basic systems, but did not make important decisions. The idea that humans of equal rank could simply trust each other to work unsupervised suggested either dangerous lack of structure or remarkable social cohesion. Kelthrin was not sure which troubled him more. The weeks rolled past and the human crew settled into their rhythm. Claire Jensen, the youngest, initially struggled with the isolation. She was used to Earth's constant connectivity, and the alien ship felt empty during certain hours. Susan Bailey noticed the rookie's discomfort and took her on geological surveys of the ship's mineral samples. They spent hours discussing rock formations and planetary composition. Claire learned that humans had to create their own structure and community. The aliens would not provide it. Nick Ford established a regular poker game that rotated through different shifts. Humans who were awake would gather in the small recreation space allocated to them and play cards while sharing stories. The aliens occasionally observed these gatherings. They seemed puzzled by the activity. It served no productive purpose, yet the humans engaged in it regularly. Nick tried to explain recreation and mental health, but the translation seemed inadequate. Kevin Palmer maintained a strict exercise routine in the cargo bay. He ran laps around the stacked supply containers and did bodyweight exercises. Several Vextar workers watched him one day as he completed his 100th push-up. One asked through a translator why he was damaging his muscle tissue deliberately. Kevin paused and explained that controlled exercise made muscles stronger. The Vextar conferred among themselves. Their species gained strength through genetic enhancement and dietary supplements, not through repeated stress. The idea of deliberately tearing muscle fibers so they would rebuild stronger seemed primitive and painful. As the eternal harvest approached Kepler 442b, Jake gathered his crew for a final briefing. The moon was a harsh environment with thin atmosphere and extreme temperature variations. The quantium deposits were deep underground, requiring extensive tunneling and excavation. The coalition had assigned humans to support roles. They would manage equipment distribution, monitor supply levels, and maintain surface facilities. The actual mining would be done by species the aliens considered more capable. Greg caught Jake's eye during this briefing, and the two men shared a knowing look. The aliens were about to learn something important. Humans had not spent 3 months traveling across space to watch others work. They were about to show the galaxy what persistence really meant. The mining operation would be the test, and humanity was ready. The surface of Kepler 442b looked like hell had frozen over and then been stripped for parts. Gray rock stretched in every direction under a sky that glowed faint purple from the distant star. The temperature outside hovered at -40 degrees during the warmest part of the day. The mining site was a massive crater where coalition survey teams had identified the richest quantium veins running deep into the moon's crust. The operation began with impressive force. 50 Vextar workers descended into the preliminary tunnels with drilling equipment that screamed against stone. 20 Zrel engineers coordinated the excavation patterns using calculations that made human computers look like children's toys. The Morphians monitored atmospheric conditions and managed the ventilation systems that kept the tunnels from filling with toxic dust. For the first 72 hours, the coalition crew worked like a perfectly synchronized machine. Jake and his human team managed the surface facilities as assigned. They tracked equipment inventory, monitored power distribution from the portable reactor, and maintained the automated systems that sorted extracted material. It was important work, but felt like watching from the sidelines. Greg Foster stood at the crater's edge and stared down into the tunnels where massive drilling machines chewed through rock. His jaw was tight, and Jake knew the old miner was frustrated. Then the coalition workers stopped. All at once, as if someone had flipped a switch, the Vextar emerged from the tunnels and headed to their regeneration chambers. The Zrel withdrew to their rest configurations. The Morphians retreated to their containment pods. Within an hour, the mining site went from frantic activity to near silence. Only a few low-level workers remained to monitor automated systems. The aliens expected the humans to rest as well. The humans looked at each other and shrugged. Kevin Palmer, Susan Bailey, and Nick Ford suited up in their environmental gear and headed down into the tunnels. Helen Cruz took over monitoring the power systems. Claire Jensen began processing the stockpiled ore samples. The work continued without pause. When the night shift ended 8 hours later, Danny Wright, Amy Brooks, and Lisa Grant took their places. The mining operation that the aliens thought had paused was actually accelerating. 72 hours after the coalition workers entered their rest cycle, they emerged refreshed and ready to continue. What they found shocked them. The excavation had progressed significantly deeper than their projections indicated. New tunnels had been opened following the quantium veins. Equipment had been repositioned for optimal efficiency. Ore samples were sorted, cataloged, and ready for processing. Crystalline Unit Vor accessed the monitoring logs and made a discovery that rippled through the alien crew like electricity. The humans had never stopped working. While every coalition species rested, humans had maintained full operations using rotating shifts. What should have been 72 hours of minimal maintenance became 72 hours of continuous human productivity. Vor brought this information to Ambassador Kelthrin, who immediately requested a meeting with Commander Morrison. Jake met the ambassador in the command center overlooking the mining site. Kelthrin's skin showed colors that the translator said indicated confusion and concern. He asked directly if the humans were damaging themselves. All known biology required rest periods. Working without pause would lead to system failures and permanent harm. Jake pulled up medical data that Lisa had been collecting. Every human showed normal vital signs. Stress hormones were slightly elevated but within acceptable ranges. Muscle fatigue markers were present but not dangerous. They were tired but not injured. Jake explained what he had tried to convey on the ship. Humans did not all need to rest simultaneously. Half the crew could sleep while the other half worked. 8 hours was enough for human recovery from moderate exertion. Then they could work another 8 hours. This cycle could continue indefinitely as long as they maintained proper nutrition and hydration. It was not punishment or desperation. It was simply how humans operated. Kelthran struggled with this information. His species and most coalition members thought in terms of group cycles. Everyone worked together, then everyone rested together. The idea of continuous operation with individuals cycling through rest seemed inefficient and chaotic. How did they maintain quality control? How did they ensure consistency? Jake smiled and said humans had been doing this for centuries. Every factory, hospital, and spacecraft from Earth operated on shift work. It was fundamental to human civilization. 1 week passed and then another. The human crew maintained their rotation flawlessly. Danny Wright joked with Claire Jensen during a shift change that this was actually easier than his 3 years on Tycho Station, where 12-hour shifts were standard. Claire laughed and mentioned her mother had been a nurse working rotating 12-hour shifts for 20 years. This was normal life for humans. The aliens monitoring the conversation recorded it for later analysis. The Vextar medical team requested permission to conduct detailed scans of the human crew. Lisa Grant agreed and supervised the examinations. The aliens discovered something remarkable in human biology. The cardiovascular system was built for sustained aerobic activity. Human muscles had a high density of slow-twitch fibers designed for endurance rather than explosive power. The cooling system using sweat glands allowed humans to regulate temperature while active. Every aspect of human physiology pointed toward the same evolutionary strategy. Keep going. Amy Brooks worked with the Jarrell scientists to explain Earth's history. Humans evolved as persistence hunters on African plains. They were not the fastest or strongest predators. Instead, they chased prey over vast distances until the animal collapsed from exhaustion. A human could not outrun a deer in a sprint, but a human could jog after that deer for hours until it simply could not run anymore. This hunting method shaped human biology over millions of years. Humans became endurance specialists. The revelation spread through the coalition crew. Suddenly the humans made sense. They were not pushing themselves dangerously. They were operating within their natural parameters. A Vextar might work for 3 days straight at incredible intensity, but a human could work at moderate intensity indefinitely with only brief rest periods. Different strategies, different capabilities, but both valid. The mining operation accelerated as the aliens began to understand how to work alongside humans. The Vextar would blast through hard rock during their active periods. Then humans would clear the debris and extend the tunnels during the Vextar rest cycle. The Jarrell would calculate optimal excavation patterns, and humans would implement those patterns during the night shifts. The Morphians would rest in their pods while humans monitored the atmospheric systems. The operation became truly continuous. 3 weeks into the excavation, disaster struck. A tunnel ceiling collapsed in Section 7, trapping 3 Jarrell workers under tons of rubble. The collapse happened during a transition period when most coalition workers were entering rest cycles. The Vextar rescue team leader assessed the situation and delivered grim news. The trapped Jarrell had maybe 30 hours of life support in their suits. The rescue required manually clearing debris because heavy equipment could not fit in the narrow tunnel and might cause further collapse. One worker could clear rubble for perhaps 4 hours before exhaustion made them dangerous. They would need to rotate teams 6 or 7 times to reach the trapped workers in time. Greg Foster stepped forward before the aliens finished planning. He volunteered the human crew for the rescue. The Vextar rescue leader hesitated. This was exactly the kind of sustained physical labor that would break most species. Greg's face was set like stone. He explained that humans specialized in exactly this type of work. Hard, steady, continuous effort over extended periods. The aliens reluctantly agreed because they had no better option. Kevin Palmer and Susan Bailey suited up and descended into the collapsed tunnel. They began moving rocks piece by piece, carefully shoring up weakened sections as they progressed. 6 hours later, Helen Cruz and Danny Wright replaced them. The first team emerged exhausted, drank water, ate protein bars, and collapsed into sleep. 6 hours after that, Greg Foster himself went down with Nick Ford. The pattern continued through the night and into the next day. 22 hours after the collapse, the human team broke through to the trapped Zerel workers. All three were alive. The humans were exhausted, their hands bleeding inside their gloves, their backs screaming with pain, but they had not stopped. They had simply kept going until the job was done. As the Zerel were lifted to safety, the entire coalition crew stood in silence watching the humans emerge from the tunnel. Something fundamental had shifted in how the aliens viewed these strange endurance specialists from Earth. News of the rescue spread through the Eternal Harvest faster than Jake thought possible. Within hours, every member of the coalition crew knew what the humans had accomplished. The Zerel workers who had been saved requested a formal meeting with the human team. They gathered in one of the larger conference spaces, and the three crystalline beings stood before the 10 humans in silence for a long moment. Then they performed what the translator identified as a gesture of profound respect in their culture, a specific arrangement of their geometric forms that expressed gratitude beyond words. The atmosphere shifted after that day. Alien crew members who had previously offered polite nods now stopped to speak with humans in the corridors. The Vextar workers asked Greg Foster for advice on tunnel stabilization techniques. The Morphians requested that Helen Cruz review their flight efficiency calculations. Danny Wright found himself invited to engineering meetings where Crystalline Unit Vor presented problems and actually listened to his suggestions. The humans were no longer guests being humored. They were colleagues. Ambassador Kelthrin called a formal briefing 3 days after the rescue. He requested that Jake, Lisa, and Amy present a comprehensive overview of human capabilities. The main assembly hall filled with representatives from every species on the ship. Jake stood at the front and felt the weight of countless alien eyes studying him. This was the moment to make humanity understood. Lisa began with the science. She displayed images of Earth's African savanna from 2 million years ago. She explained how early humans were not apex predators. They could not overpower prey with strength like lions. They could not outrun prey with speed like cheetahs. Instead, they developed a different strategy entirely. They became persistence hunters. She showed videos from modern Earth of hunters tracking antelope across vast distances. The antelope would sprint away in panic, but humans would simply follow at a steady jog. Hours would pass. The antelope would stop to rest, and the humans would appear again on the horizon. Eventually, the animal would collapse from heat exhaustion and cardiovascular failure, while the humans remained functional. Amy took over and explained the biological adaptations that made this possible. Human legs and feet were engineered for distance running. The Achilles tendon acted like a spring, storing and releasing energy with each step. Human bodies had more sweat glands than almost any other mammal, allowing them to cool down while moving. Other animals had to stop and pant to release heat. Humans just kept sweating and kept moving. The human cardiovascular system could maintain aerobic activity for hours because it was designed exactly for that purpose. Jake added the psychological component. Humans had developed mental capabilities that complemented their physical endurance. They could push through discomfort and pain by focusing on goals. They could encourage each other and work as teams over extended periods. They had invented concepts like determination, stubbornness, and sheer force of will. These were not just poetic ideas. They were survival traits that allowed humans to continue when their bodies said to stop. The alien audience absorbed this information in stunned silence. A senior Vextar scientist named Korath stood and asked permission to speak. He presented comparative data his team had compiled over the past weeks. Every coalition species, he explained, was built for specialization. The Vextar had immense strength and could work at high intensity for days, but their metabolism produced toxic byproducts that required extensive purging. The Zerel could process information at incredible speeds, and their crystalline structure was nearly indestructible, but prolonged stress caused fractures that took weeks to heal. The Morphians could exist in environments that would kill solid beings, but maintaining gaseous cohesion required frequent reconstitution. Every species had a pattern of extreme capability, followed by mandatory recovery. They were sprinters in their own ways. Humans were not sprinters. They were marathon runners. They could not match the peak output of most coalition species, but they did not need to. They maintained steady output over time periods that other species found incomprehensible. Korath displayed a graph that showed productivity over a 30-day period. Coalition species showed massive spikes followed by valleys. The human line was nearly flat, a consistent moderate output with only slight variations. Over time, that consistency added up to impressive totals. The implications rippled through the assembled aliens. Ambassador Kelthrin asked the question that Jake knew was coming. If humans were this capable, why had they presented themselves as weak during first contact? Jake smiled and explained that humans were not weak. They were careful. Human medical science emphasized health and wellness. Doctors recommended 8 hours of sleep and reasonable work schedules because that was optimal for long-term health. Humans could push harder when needed, but they did not make that their default setting. It was the difference between capability and sustainability. Nick Ford stood and added something that made the aliens pause. He told them about marathons. On Earth, humans ran races over 42 kilometers for recreation. Thousands of people participated in these events regularly. Some humans ran ultramarathons that lasted 24 hours or more. They did this for fun, not survival or work. The concept of deliberately exhausting yourself for enjoyment seemed to break something in the alien understanding of logical behavior. The mining operation transformed after that briefing. Ambassador Kelthrin authorized humans to take primary roles in excavation rather than just support duties. The work patterns reorganized to take advantage of human persistence. Greg Foster designed new shift schedules that kept tunnels active around the clock. Susan Bailey mapped the quantium veins and identified routes that required steady work, rather than explosive effort. Danny. Wright modified equipment to be more ergonomic for sustained use rather than short bursts of maximum power. What had been projected as a 6-month mining operation began to look like it might finish in 4 months. The numbers did not lie. Continuous operation was simply more efficient than the burst and rest cycle the Coalition had always used. The aliens began to understand that humans were not just another species with unique biology. They represented a fundamentally different approach to work itself. Claire Jensen experienced this shift most dramatically. As the youngest and least experienced crew member, she had struggled with feeling inadequate around the powerful alien workers. But during week 5, a Vextar named Corthan approached her during a shift change. He asked how she maintained focus during long periods of repetitive work. Claire was surprised by the question. She explained that she broke tasks into smaller goals and celebrated tiny victories. Move 10 rocks, take a breath, move 10 more. The Vextar studied her for a moment and then said something that the translator rendered as profound respect. His species worked until they dropped. They had never considered pacing as a strategy. The cultural exchange went both directions. Humans learned that the Drell experienced time differently because of their crystalline neural structure. What felt like hours to a human passed in moments for them during calculation work, which explained why they seemed to work at impossible speeds. The Morphians taught Helen about navigating in higher dimensions, concepts that hurt her brain but expanded her understanding of space. The Vexitar shared their regeneration techniques, and Lisa discovered parallels to human meditation practices. One evening, as Jake reviewed progress reports, he realized something important. The aliens had not just learned about human endurance. They had learned about human culture. The poker games, the exercise routines, the jokes during difficult moments, the way humans encouraged each other during hard shifts. All of it was part of the same adaptation. Humans had evolved to work together over extended periods. They had developed social bonds and communication methods that made persistence possible. A human alone might give up. Humans together kept going. Ambassador Kelthrin visited Jake in the command center as week 6 concluded. The tall alien settled into a chair and looked at the mining site below. He admitted that the Coalition had completely misunderstood humanity during first contact. They saw weakness where there was actually a different kind of strength. They saw limitations where there was adaptability. The galaxy was about to change because humans did not fit any existing category. They were something new, and Kelthrin was not sure if the Coalition was ready for what that meant. The alarm that woke Jake from sleep was not one he recognized. Red lights pulsed through the human quarters and a sound like grinding metal echoed through the walls. He pulled on clothes and ran to the command center where Ambassador Kelthrin stood surrounded by frantic alien crew members. The ambassador's skin showed colors that the translator identified as extreme alarm. The star that Kepler 442b orbited was entering an unexpected active phase. Massive solar flares were erupting from its surface, and radiation levels on the moon would become lethal within 96 hours. The mining operation was 90% complete. Months of work had extracted vast quantities of quantium, but 10% remained in the deepest veins. For the coalition, abandoning that final portion meant the entire expedition would barely break even financially. The cost of the journey, the equipment, and the crew time would consume most of the profit. Kelthrin explained this with a voice that sounded like defeat. They had no choice but to evacuate and accept the loss. Jake asked how much work remained in actual labor hours. A Jrel engineer named Vex ran calculations and provided an estimate. Approximately 384 hours of continuous excavation, extraction, and processing. The work required skilled operators on heavy equipment, precise tunnel work, and constant monitoring of structural integrity. Under normal circumstances, with their full crew working in standard cycles, it would take 3 weeks. They had 4 days before radiation made the surface uninhabitable. Greg Foster leaned over the display showing the mine layout and traced the remaining quantium veins with his finger. He looked at Jake and asked permission to speak with the human crew privately. Kelthrin granted it, though his expression suggested he thought it was pointless. The 10 humans gathered in their quarters and Greg laid out the situation bluntly. 4 days meant 96 hours. If they ran 3 shifts of 8 hours each with 4 people per shift, they could maintain continuous operations. It would be exhausting and possibly dangerous, but it was mathematically possible. Danny Wright pulled up structural data on his tablet and studied the remaining excavation zones. The work was not technically complex, but it required constant attention. One mistake could cause a collapse or damage equipment they could not replace. They would be working in environmental suits as radiation levels climbed. They would be tired, stressed, and pushing their limits. But humans had done harder things. Claire Jensen, who had been quiet during the discussion, spoke up. Her voice was steady despite her youth. She said her grandfather had worked in the coal mines of West Virginia for 40 years. 12-hour shifts in dangerous conditions day after day. If he could do that for 4 decades, she could do this for 4 days. The vote was unanimous. The humans would complete the operation themselves. Jake brought the decision to Ambassador Kelthrin, who physically recoiled. The ambassador argued it was too dangerous. The coalition could not allow a newly contacted species to take such a risk. The ethical implications were staggering. What if the humans injured themselves or died? How would the coalition justify that to Earth? Jake responded simply. This was what humans did. This was what they had always done. They looked at impossible tasks and started working anyway. They endured. Kelthrin tried different arguments. The humans were valuable. Their unique capabilities meant the galaxy needed them. Risking 10 humans for profit was unconscionable. Greg Foster cut through the diplomatic language with his rough miner's voice. The ambassador was thinking about this wrong. This was not about profit. This was about finishing what they started. Humans did not walk away from a job 90% complete. That was not in their nature. Besides, 4 days of hard work would not kill them. It would just make them very tired and very hungry. The coalition crew withdrew to the ship while the humans prepared for their marathon. Lisa Grant distributed medical supplies and made everyone promise to report any sign of serious distress. Helen Cruz programmed the equipment for maximum efficiency and created a schedule that rotated people through different tasks to prevent repetitive stress injuries. Kevin Palmer organized the supply lines to ensure food, water, and equipment were always available. Amy Brooks set up monitoring stations to track radiation levels and provide early warning if conditions deteriorated faster than predicted. Claire Jensen, Greg Foster, Kevin Palmer, and Susan Bailey took the first shift. They descended into the mines as the coalition crew watched from the ship's observation decks. The work began with the methodical precision of people who understood the stakes. Greg operated the main excavation drill while Susan directed him to the richest quantium veins. Kevin cleared debris and shored up tunnel walls. Claire managed the extraction equipment that separated valuable ore from worthless rock. 8 hours later, they emerged exhausted and the second team descended. Danny Wright, Helen Cruz, Nick Ford, and Amy Brooks took over. The pattern continued without deviation. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours of work again. The aliens monitored human vital signs obsessively. Heart rates elevated but remained in safe ranges. Core temperatures rose from exertion, but the environmental suits kept them from overheating. Stress hormones spiked then leveled off. The humans showed fatigue but not breakdown. 60 hours into the operation, Claire stumbled and fell in tunnel section 4. She had been moving rocks for 6 hours and her legs simply gave out. The Vextar observers thought this was the breaking point, but Susan Bailey helped her sit down, made her drink an entire bottle of water, and fed her a protein bar. 30 minutes later, Claire was back on her feet. She told the concerned Zarel medic monitoring her that she was fine. She had just forgotten to hydrate properly. It happened sometimes when you got focused on work. She would be more careful. The 72-hour mark passed. This was the point where a Vextar would be completely spent, where most coalition species would require days of recovery. The humans were visibly exhausted. Their movements were slower and more deliberate. They made occasional mistakes that they had to correct, but they did not stop. Danny Wright operated the mining drill with hands that shook slightly from fatigue, but his control remained precise. He had done this motion 10,000 times, and his body remembered, even when his mind was foggy with tiredness. Jake worked the third shift, rotation alongside Lisa Grant and 2 others. From the first team who had rested, he felt every one of his 43 years in his aching back and burning shoulders. The environmental suit felt like it weighed twice what it should. His eyes hurt from focusing on displays, and his head pounded from dehydration despite drinking water constantly. But the work continued because stopping was not an option they had allowed themselves. 94 hours after they began, with just 2 hours remaining before radiation levels crossed into lethal territory, Captain Greg Foster extracted the final quantium deposit. The 10 humans staggered back to the ship, their suits stained with rock dust and their faces showing the strain of 4 days without real rest. They collapsed into their quarters and slept for 12 straight hours. When they woke, Lisa conducted medical examinations. Kevin had strained muscles in his lower back. Susan showed signs of mild dehydration despite drinking constantly. Claire had blisters on both hands from equipment operation. Nick had a minor heat exhaustion incident. Nothing was permanent. Within 24 hours, they were all moving normally again, eating massive meals and joking about their aching bodies. The Eternal Harvest began its journey back to Earth with a full cargo hold of quantium. Ambassador Kelthrin requested a private meeting with Jake before they reached home. The alien diplomat admitted that everything the Coalition thought they knew about capability and limitation had been challenged by watching humans work. They had species that could lift mountains and species that could think at the speed of light, but they had never encountered a species that could simply decide to do something impossible and then do it through sheer determination. Kelthrin presented an official document with the Coalition seal. Earth's status was being elevated to full membership, not as observers or junior partners but as equals. More than that, humanity was being offered a specific role in the galactic community. There were operations throughout Coalition space that required endurance. Exploration missions that took years, mining operations in harsh conditions, rescue work that demanded sustained effort, construction projects that needed steady hands over long periods. The Coalition had species for every specialized task, but they had no one who could simply keep going regardless of circumstances. Jake accepted the document and felt the weight of what it meant. Humanity was joining the galaxy not as the strongest or fastest or smartest species. They were joining as the species that did not quit. The species that looked at a 4-day deadline for 4 weeks of work and just started drilling. The species that evolved to chase prey across endless plains until it collapsed, and carried that same relentless persistence into the stars. The human crew gathered on the observation deck as Earth came into view. That small blue marble had produced a species that the galaxy did not know it needed. Claire stood next to Greg and asked him if he thought other humans would come out here now that the door was open. The old miner smiled and said he was certain of